The first aim of the statistical modelling exercise is to identify the best predictors for describing differences in the seizure rate and reporting rate between countries and over time. For seizure rate, two variables were found to be important. The first is the law enforcement ratio, which is a proxy for law enforcement effectiveness and is derived from the seizures data itself. The second, rule of law, is one of the World Bank's governance indicators and describes the background, sort of environmental background within which law enforcement officers are operating. The higher both these two variables are, the higher the sort of law enforcement is within the country. And therefore we find as these increase, so the seizure rate increases as well. For reporting rate, we again have found two variables that were important. The first was the data collection score, which is a proxy for the effort made by CITES management authorities and ETIS to report and obtain records of illegal ivory seizures. Essentially, the higher this score is, the greater the chance there is that all seizures that a country has made have been reported into ETIS. The CITES reporting score is a proxy for how seriously a country takes reporting to CITES in general. So again, it's like a background variable describing the environment within which CITES management authorities are operating. The higher the reporting score, the greater the amount of reportings there is to CITES by that country. So again, we find that the reporting rate increases as the data collection score and the CITES reporting score increase. So given that we now have these four predictor variables, we're now able to say something about the illegal ivory transactions, which is what we're actually interested in, using our data on the ETIS records and these four predictor variables. And we want to say something about two different things: the number of illegal ivory transactions, which we represent with a transactions index, and the total weight of illegal ivory, which we represent with a weight index. So what we can do is see how this bias adjustment, which is what we'll call it, how this works for two. So we can now see how this all works for two countries, Cameroon and USA, on this particular slide. Using the predictor variables we saw on the previous page, we can first of all estimate the relative seizure and reporting rate for each country for each year. So on the top half of this slide, we can see the seizure rate, which is orange, and the reporting rate, which is blue, for Cameroon, which is figure A, and the USA, which is figure B. The seizure rate in orange has a dark line in the middle, which is our best estimate of the seizure rate, and as we move away from our best estimate, we become less confident that that is the sort of relative seizure rate. And we show an 80% interval here. And a similar idea holds for the reporting rate, but these are credible intervals are much tighter in this case. We can see for Cameroon that we have in general a very low reporting rate, except for 2004 where it peaks. Essentially, in Cameroon, the reported seizures came not from the CITES management authority, who are meant to do it officially, but instead from NGOs, non-governmental organisations, apart from in 2004 where reports were made by the CMA itself. The seizure rate starts off quite low and tends to increase a bit over time. In the United States, we can see we've got a very high reporting rate, and this is mainly because they have an automated process for collecting seizure reports and sending them to ETIS. So there's quite high confidence that the data in ETIS represents most of the seizures or all of the seizures that have been made in the USA. And again, we can see that the seizure rate is also quite high in the United States. If we then look at figure C, we can see the reported number of seizures for the USA in purple and Cameroon in green for the small raw ivory class, that is, seizures that were less than 10 kilograms in weight. And you can see that Cameroon has reported very few seizures, none from 96, 97, 98, 99, and then sort of a few as we move to the later years, and a peak in 2000. In comparison, we can see that United States is sort of making around 15 and generally more than that seizures, and it's starting to decline in the last few years. But generally, we can see it's making a lot more seizures. However, if we then adjust the actual data for these different relative seizure and reporting rates, we get a very different picture. Figure D shows our sort of transactions index, which is our relative number of illegal ivory transactions that we think are happening in each country. Remember, they're not the actual amounts, they're just relative values. We can see that the USA, which is still the purple line, is now generally a lot less than Cameroon, apart from the first few years. Again, we have this idea that the darker the line, the more likely we think it is that the actual sort of transactions index is that value, and we have an 80% credible interval around it. And the reason why USA has much lower values than Cameroon is because of the much lower seizure and reporting rates in Cameroon. So although they've only reported a few, we don't think that represents all of the activity that's going on in the country. In comparison, for the United States, we think the reported seizures are a much closer representation of the total amount of activity within the country. So you can see that the bias adjustment is important for correcting for differences in seizure and reporting rates between countries, and also to some extent over time. So we've seen how bias adjustment can change the sort of reported seizures to give quite different results for the transactions index once we've accounted for variable seizure and reporting rates. We carried out this analysis for each of the 68 countries we used, and for each of the 6 ivory classes, and then combine them together to get a global transactions index. And using a method and building on that methodology, we also ended up with a weights index as well. Figure A here shows the global transactions index, and we have standardized so that the 1998 value is set to 100. We can see from this there's been quite a rapid increase in illegal ivory trade activity in the last few years. In particular, in 2011, illegal ivory trade activity was about 3 times the activity in 1998 and about twice the activity in 2008. In terms of looking at the picture, the dots represent our best estimate of the transactions index, and the line represents a 90% credible interval. The second graph shows the global weights index, and we can see a similar picture in that in 1998 we have about a third of the amount of ivory in circulation that we have in 2011. Again, we can see that rapid increase in the amount of ivory in circulation over the last few years.